Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Sha'ar Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 215 for the 26th of Sivan in a leap year. So today we're going to talk about the phrase to wrap your head around something, namely a concept. So this is a very common term that we use when we are trying to understand something, when we're trying to grasp something, maybe usually something that is really new to us, a novel concept, something that is really hard for us to understand at first glance. And then we try to make sense of it. And we say, I'm trying to wrap my head around this idea, this thing that you're telling me. So maybe you've thought of this phrase at times when you've been listening to this podcast, perhaps, that you've been trying to wrap your head around some of these concepts that we've been learning. So if you think about this phrase, it's really interesting because it's actually alluding to a very deep idea. It's alluding to the fact that when we have a concept that we're trying to grasp in our mind, what our mind is actually doing is it's wrapping itself around that concept. And what we're going to be learning about today is this actually has a parallel in God. And there's a parallel in the sense of the way that when we wrap our head around a certain concept, this alludes to the fact that we understand and that we know this concept. God does a very similar thing in the sense of when we say that God wraps himself around the world, that he knows everything in the world, he's also wrapping his head, so to speak, around the world. And the phrase for this in Hebrew, in Kabbalistic and Hasidic literature, is Sovev Kol Almin, encompasses all the world. However, just as important as it is for us to know this and try to relate to this idea of the wrapping our head around something in the sense that God also wraps himself around the world, we also have to understand the difference between us and God in this sense. Because at the end of the day, when we are wrapping our head around a concept, around an idea, at the end of the day, we say this and we mean it in a very figurative way. Like, we're not actually wrapping our head around the concept itself. Like, we are on an intellectual and in a figurative kind of sense that there's like a conception of this idea in our minds. However, the actual idea itself, the actual thing itself that we're thinking about is not inside of our heads, right? Like, that would be ridiculous to think about. So like, for example, if we were trying to understand the way that a Tesla works, right? Like an electric vehicle. So if we're trying to wrap our head around how a Tesla works and somebody explains to us the intricacies of the whole thing, and we study many books and things like that and read a lot of articles. So we're wrapping our head around the concept of the Tesla on some level in a way that we can understand. However, the Tesla exists outside of our mind. It's not inside of our head, right? Like, that would be ridiculous to think that it was inside of our head. However, when it comes to God, this is where the difference lies. Because when it comes to God, and when we talk about God and the way that he knows the world and the way that he wraps himself around the world, the way he is Sovev Kol Almin, all of the worlds, not just our worlds, but all of the worlds, then we literally mean this. We mean that God is literally encompassing all the worlds, meaning that the worlds literally are contained within him. Because we know that the difference between the concept that we're grasping and the world, when it comes to us and when it comes to God, is we didn't create this concept. This is a concept that exists outside of who we are. Versus when it comes to the world, the entire world that God is grasping was created and is being constantly created by him, and actually its entire existence and substance actually is only there because God is constantly bringing it into creation, something from nothing at all times. So let's see how the Alter Rebbe explains this. So for context, again, we are still in the middle of chapter 7 of Sha'ar HaYichud V'Haemunah. It's quite a long chapter. We still are going to be with this chapter for another few days. And so here we go. So the Alter Rebbe says that in continuing from last time, where we were talking about this idea about how it is that God fills all the worlds, but yet is not affected by any of the worlds. Now we're going to look at another aspect of God, not the aspect of God that fills all the worlds, but the aspect of God that encompasses all the worlds, the Sovev Kol Almin. And as a side note, these two terms, Mamalik Kol Almin and Sovev Kol Almin, come up a lot in Chassidus, in terms of understanding how it is that we can relate to God. So you can kind of keep those two ideas in your mind, that on the one hand, we think of God in the sense of being filling all the worlds, being Mamalik Kol Almin. And then there's another aspect of God, which is the aspect of Sovev Kol Almin, encompassing all the worlds. This is the aspect we're focusing on today. And then the Alter Rebbe says that we can understand this, we can somewhat understand this idea of Sovev Kol Almin, of encompassing all the worlds, when we think of it, how it is that a person meditates upon some type of concept in their minds, or upon some physical object in their minds. Then we say that this person's minds and thoughts encompass this object, which is illustrated inside of their thoughts or their minds. So, like, let's say if you think about a car, then that car is encompassed within your thoughts. However, we're not actually grasping the car itself. We're not actually grasping the thing itself truly in like a literal sense, as was explained in the introduction. And this is where it differs for God, because when it comes to God, we know that there's a teaching, and this comes from Yeshayahu chapter 55, verse 8, where it says, "Ki lo machshavotay machshavotechem v'gomer." For my thoughts are not your thoughts. So the way that we think is not the way God thinks. God's thoughts and our thoughts are very different. And we've talked about this previously in Tanya as well, where we learned that God's thoughts and God's knowledge, in the sense that when we say that God knows all of his creations, this means that God is actually literally encompassing every single creation in a literal and actual sense. Because why? Like, what does this mean, that God is encompassing every single thing in a literal and actual sense? Because we know that God's knowledge is the vitality and the existence of every single thing. And it's bringing into existence something from nothing, every single creature, every single creation in a true and actual sense at every moment. So that's the end of the section. So just to recap. So again, there's an aspect of God that we're focusing on today, which is the aspect of God who encompasses all the worlds, who surrounds all the worlds. And the way that we can understand this kind of in a definitional sense, what this means is the way that we understand or grasp a concept or an idea or a thing in our minds. Like when we think of a certain object or when we think of a concept in our minds, then we say that we are wrapping our head around this concept or the thing itself, or grasping the object in our minds. But when we say this, we mean this in a figurative sense. We don't mean that we literally have a car inside of our head, when we all know that, right? Versus for God, it's very different, because when God encompasses the world with his knowledge, we literally mean that the world is within him, that God is encompassing the literal world, because we know that the world, not only our world, but all of the worlds, their entire vitality and their entire existence is God's knowledge itself. That's where it's coming from. That's where it receives its vitality from. So that's it for today, and we will continue with this tomorrow, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.